Trevor Lawrence got a massive paycheck this offseason, but it is time for him to prove he is worth being a top paid quarterback in this league. We discuss Lawrence's and the rest of the Jaguars' 2024 fantasy outlook on today's episode of Locked On Fantasy Football.
You are Locked On Fantasy, your daily NFL fantasy podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thanks for making Locked On Fantasy Football your first listen every day. I'm one of your co-hosts, Michelle Magdziuk, and when I'm not doing this, I'm a researcher and fantasy analyst with NFL Network.
And I'm your other co-host, Vinnie Iyer. When I'm not doing this, I'm writing about NFL fantasy and betting for sportingnews.com. Big week as training camps open all across the NFL.
Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. We are getting so much closer to the season. As you mentioned, rookies are reporting to training camp for many teams today. Next week, we'll have veterans return. We're almost through all 32 teams. We're getting through there. We're on the AFC South right now. On the Jaguars, we already hit on the Colts, and who else did we do? We did the Texans and the Colts. So we're hitting on the Jaguars today. They are a fun team because they have a lot of top talent, right? But they don't necessarily get everything out of these guys. So last year, 9-8, missed the playoffs after starting 8-3. They went 1-5 over the last 6 weeks. You can blame that maybe on Trevor Lawrence getting injured multiple times. I mean, he dealt with multiple injuries over the back half of that season, especially over those last 6 weeks when they were losing games. But the Jaguars said, you know what, Trevor, we're still going to make you the highest paid quarterback in the league. They gave him a 5-year, $275 million extension this offseason, and that's tied with Joe Burrow for the highest APY among quarterbacks and just in the league. So it's crazy. They're trusting him. They're trusting him to become the elite quarterback that they thought he could be coming out of school. Last year, we got some really good fantasy production out of Travis Etienne and Evan Engram. Etienne was the RB3 overall. Engram was the tight end 2 overall behind only Sam Laporta. Calvin Ridley had the highest scoring. He was the highest scoring Jaguars wide receiver in fantasy, but he left for the Titans this offseason. The Jaguars bring in Gabe Davis, so how so fun, and then drafted Brian Thomas Jr., wide receiver out of LSU, in the first round. Getting started on their fantasy outlook, let's start with Trevor Lawrence because we need him to pick it up. He's your boy, right? He finished as the quarterback 17 in fantasy points per game last year, quarterback 12 overall. Tell me why he's going to be better next year for fantasy, Vinny.
Well, it was really disappointing, I'll say that, because he was in the top 10, and a lot of it was a little bit tied to maybe a spike in the running. He had a few touchdowns there that kind of padded his stats, but he also had a key receiver that he connected with in the first year, actually, both of them, Christian Kirk and Evan Engram from 2022. But in 2023, Kirk was hurt, and I think this really hurt the offense. I know they brought in Calvin Ridley, but Kirk was so critical, right? The first year he came in, he was the go-to guy all over the field for Trevor Lawrence. Then he wasn't really available, and that's what led to kind of Ingram's big season. He had to throw to him a lot in the middle of the field. And then you had Calvin Ridley flash some big games, but nothing consistent there. They had Zay Jones as well, who was also missing some time. And that was key because they couldn't line their 11 personnel the way they wanted for Doug Peterson and Press Taylor. So there were some little things that went wrong here. They also were trying to sort out their offensive line. I think it'll be a little bit better up front this year. Cam Robinson was dealing with some things as well. So a lot of issues that hurt Trevor Lawrence may be gone this year, and getting some new faces here in Thomas and Davis. And Davis is a big playmaker, and I'm glad they actually drafted Thomas because I don't think Davis is a guy you want holding up consistently on the outside as kind of your number one receiver. He's a big play threat. Brian Thomas, however, profiles more like that classic number one that you would put on the outside, more in that Zay Jones role, where I think you'll see Gabe Davis more in that Ridley role as the big play kind of guy playing off the other spot. So that's what we expect from the 11 personnel. We'll see how it plays out. They have a little bit more interesting wide receiver scenarios here with Thomas in the mix. So all that says Trevor Lawrence should be better. Like, there's no excuse. He just got the big contract here. Again, he needs to be much better. And again, it wasn't terrible last year because he did in terms of playing every game and playing through the pain. That was another thing. keep in mind, Lawrence was hurting in a lot of the games, but he kind of grinded through. He finished at QB 12 overall. So one thing he did, Michelle, was stay on the field. He just didn't put up a lot of numbers when he stayed in the field. That was his biggest attribute, that he outlasted a lot of quarterbacks in staying healthy last season, even when he wasn't healthy. So again, I'm going to be kind of maybe once bitten, twice shy here about Trevor Lawrence, and then we have to see it to believe it. But again, his ranking is more manageable this year. There's not the hype. So maybe you find a post-hype sleeper right now, QB 15 there. That's not a bad value. I think he can easily go above that, given he finishes QB 12 overall. So all that to say, I think Trevor Lawrence now is more reasonable as a player that you could target versus last year. The hype was just too much. What we're seeing with CJ Stroud this year.
Yeah, my biggest issue with Lawrence is we just don't see a lot of those big games. He finally started to do them before he injured himself in week 13. But so he only had 3 weeks last year as a top 10 fantasy quarterback finish. And that was weeks 11 through 13. So it was 3 weeks in a row. Unfortunately, then he gets injured, right? But I will say he's had issues with turnovers, but 7 of his 14 interceptions last year came over the last 4 games of the season that he's played. That was after he suffered a high ankle sprain in week 13. He played through that. He was placed in concussion protocol in week 15. He didn't miss time after that. And then he had an AC joint sprain in the shoulder in week 16. He did miss 1 game, and then came back for week 18. But the end of his season was brutal. He was better efficiency wise when you look at his overall stats, not so much for fantasy, but from weeks 1 through 13, like his stats weren't as bad as they looked at the end of the year. Those last few games he played during the season really hurt him, but still, for him to deserve this paycheck, he still had to be way better than what he was from weeks 1 through 13 last year before his injury. And also for him to be good for fantasy, like the only reason he had those top 10 fantasy weeks was because he started randomly scoring rushing touchdowns, right? Like he scored a lot of rushing touchdowns during that span. Now they do tend to use him around the goal line because really they only have Travis Etienne, smaller back. So like I think overall Lawrence is going to typically have 4 to 6 rushing touchdowns, which is really great. But the passing touchdowns have not been there at all. 12, obviously rookie season, whatever, we can throw that away. 25 in 2022, 21 in 2023. For a guy who plays like he does, more of a pocket guy, he's going to get you some rushing yards, but definitely you're not going to be able to lean on that in fantasy. He needs to throw 30 plus passing touchdowns. He has to prove that. Now with a rookie wide receiver and Brian Thomas Jr. likely being, I don't know, is 1 or 2. You brought up Christian Kirk will be back. He probably leads the team in targets. We'll get to him later. And then Gabe Davis. Do you think with those weapons he can throw 30 touchdowns this year?
Yeah, I mean, he has the potential to do that. I mean, I think Doug Peterson and Press Taylor, a lot of this fell on them a little bit because of
Don't you hate that they kept Press Taylor? Like he's still the OC.
Yeah, I don't understand that. I mean, they should adjust their offense a little bit. They didn't adjust well enough. Okay, Zay Jones is out, Christian Kirk is out. Move Calvin Ridley around. Do some things like change up. They're not a very good adjusting duo, I should say. I mean, it goes back to like, okay, things are great in 2017 or whenever when Carson Wentz was going off in year 2, MVP candidate, putting up numbers. Then what do we see at the end of Doug Peterson's tenure? Carson Wentz kind of being a lame duck QB post injury, not living up to expectations. So too many wide ranging outcomes, and it's partly because they don't adjust. Like work around what you have. So maybe because they don't adjust, you restock the cupboard, and then maybe that helps just by natural having the weapons that he has to produce, right? So I think Trevor Lawrence is not necessarily the problem. I think the reason he got paid is, heck, he played through those injuries and fought through when the team was struggling, maybe to his own detriment, right? Maybe he should have sat out a game, got a little healthier, and played a little bit better in those games and not made us want to even think about playing him. So again, he's a gamer. He's always going to fight through. Might be always a better reality quarterback than fantasy quarterback as we go forward. But yeah, I mean, he's gotten paid. Let's see the numbers here. And again, the biggest thing is you got Davis, you got Thomas, stretch the field a little bit more, open up the offense. Then you can still use Kirk and Engram and Etienne, whatever you want, like underneath routes. So open it up, spread it around, not just horizontally, but vertically as well in this offense. Stretch the field, open things up. That's when Carson Wentz had his big fantasy season before he got hurt in 17 with Peterson.
And we're looking at his ADP, it's like he's going late, right? It's not like people are
Yeah.
hoping, like
Yeah.
liking
Good
him this
shot.
year in drafts. He's going as quarterback 16, 106 overall. There's 3 quarterbacks going in a 6-pick span on average. It's Justin Herbert, Trevor Lawrence, Caleb Williams. Very, very quickly before we finish this first segment, order those 3 guys in terms of your likeliness to draft them. Herbert, Lawrence, Williams.
Oh boy, I think Herbert is last. I just don't trust that offense. I think I go Williams first, then Lawrence. So easy for me, I think, on that one, based on the style of offenses these guys will be in.
I think I go Herbert, Williams, Lawrence.
Okay.
Maybe Williams, Herbert, Lawrence, but
Okay.
definitely Lawrence would be third in that
Yeah.
group. And also, I'd rather Kirk Cousins and maybe even Matthew Stafford over him. I actually think Trevor Lawrence will have a solid enough year, but I just don't trust his upside. I think, quarterback 8 might be kind of his upside. I want to shoot for something a little bit higher than that. We're going to get into the 2 best fantasy options on this team in terms of what they did last year, right? Running back Travis Etienne and Evan Engram both finished top 3 at their position last year. So we're going to dig into their 2024 fantasy outlook. I'm a little bit lower on both of them this year, and I have a feeling you are as well. It'll be fun to discuss.
Yep, absolutely. And again, those 2 guys have been pretty key for Trevor Lawrence. We'll see if they come through here in 2024. This episode of Locked On Fantasy Football is sponsored and brought to you by BetterHelp. And if you've been thinking about giving therapy a try, BetterHelp is there for you. It is the best way you can get attached to a therapist and find the person that can guide you through what you're going through the best way and with your way. And with BetterHelp, I cannot stress enough that I've really benefited from therapy over the years. I've been consistently seeing one for more than a decade, and some of us are wondering, how do we take that first step? How do we get comfortable with that therapist? Well, that's why BetterHelp is here to help you just get on board. So check it out. If you're thinking about starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient to you, flexible and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire and you'll get matched with a licensed therapist. And you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. So everything is there for you to give BetterHelp a try. Stop comparing your life to others and start focusing on what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, H-E-L-P, betterhelp.com/locked on. All right, let's get into the 2 stars from last year that were absolutely great in fantasy, partly because the things that were happening with Trevor Lawrence not producing and different things happening with the receiving core. Travis Etienne and Evan Engram. Right now, the ADP for Travis Etienne is RB9, 24th overall. So he's the RB1 right now. Last year, RB6 in points per game, RB3 overall. So it all lines up with that and giving him a little bit of a cushion to say that he's going to be a little bit higher than that. Evan Engram, right now, he slipped to tight end 7. Last year, he was tight end 6 in points per game. So right there where his production is. So let's start with those baselines. Let's start with Etienne. How are you feeling about him and that kind of solid running back 1 status he has?
I think with him, we all just have such a gross taste in our mouths from the second half of that season. It's hard to trust him. So the first half, I mean, he was absolutely amazing, averaging 19 points per game in half PPR from weeks 1 through 8, 22 touches per game he averaged, and he scored 8 touchdowns during that span. Then they had a week 9 bye, and all of that changed, right? Then he goes down from weeks 10 through 18, average 11.4 points per game, only had 16 touches per game, 4 touchdowns. Now, he did suffer that rib injury in week 12, but his usage was already going down in those 2 weeks before that. It did go down even further after the rib injury, and then you had Trevor Lawrence's injury, so the offense wasn't moving as well. But he is very much touchdown or bust. He averaged 10 points per game in the 10 games without a rushing touchdown last year, and then 22 points per game in the 7 games with a rushing touchdown last year. So when you're drafting him, you're going to need him to put up 11, 12, 13 rushing touchdowns to feel the benefit of taking him at RB9 overall. Could he do it on a good offense? Absolutely. But he just doesn't get enough targets to feel great. He even got 73 targets last year, but I think that's pretty much his ceiling, and it's just not consistent.
Yeah, and we thought Tank Bigsby was going to be a thing last year, and I
Right.
really
Did not
thought
happen.
he might be. I mean, he actually scored in week 1, if everyone remembers that. And we thought, oh, he's going to steal all the goal line carries and the touches. He's a bigger back, and Travis Etienne is going to be involved this way. I never expected Travis Etienne to be a touchdown machine in the NFL. I thought he was a little small, and he's going to have to depend on some few bursts in the end zone, right? Like catching a pass 15 yards and taking it in, or a 7-yard run, something like that, right? But he turns out to be a pretty good red zone back, and Trevor Lawrence obviously trusts him. They played at Clemson together, and they were scoring all the touchdowns together when that offense was really humming for Dabo Swinney. So when I look at this, they do have good chemistry, and that's part of it. And I think he's been fortunate where there's no one stepping in, and Etienne has kind of held the key volume here and key leverage, high leverage roles, right? So when you look at that, like not much is changing there. I think he's solid. I can't say he's spectacular. I mean, there's some games I know he had the multiple touchdowns, but that's a hard thing to duplicate. But I don't see this guy like having a Christian McCaffrey type game, right? Where he's like 10 carries for 80 yards plus 5 catches for 40 and a touchdown. Like I don't see those games happening very often for Travis Etienne, because they're also very calculated with his usage a little bit as well, even though he is the lead back. So it's kind of frustrating in that sense, where they're just not going to say, here's 25 touches per game, let's roll with it, right? So we'll just be a little bit careful with him. But yeah, looking at the people around him, Kyron Williams, look, I feel a little bit better about him with the key role, even if you get Blake Corum later. Then you get Devon Achane. I think he's going to have a big role here. And I think Raheem Mostert's not going to hold up. Derrick Henry, I love behind Etienne. Isaiah Pacheco even has kind of a little bit of juice. Josh Jacobs, Rashad White, James Cook. I have to say, Michelle, I don't know if I want to force myself into getting Travis Etienne when I look at all these values ahead and behind him.
Yeah, I know, especially like he's right next to Kyron Williams. I'm taking Williams over Etienne, even though like Etienne has a very stable workload, right? 267 carries last year. Bigsby, like you brought up, 50. That was the second most on the team. Like he's going to be the workhorse guy. Well, Kyron Williams maybe has a split with Blake Corum, but I feel better about Kyron Williams overall. But my real interest one that I want to ask you here is Devon Achane, because we know he's going to split a backfield, maybe with just Mostert, maybe with more guys than that. And then Etienne, they're going at 21st overall and 24th overall. Which one would you choose if you're choosing between those two?
I'm going with Achane because here's why. I don't expect Raheem Mostert. I mean, this guy's had a lot of knee injuries. He's 32. He's going to be 32 years old. It's going to break down at one point. And remember, Achane was not healthy to begin last year. He wasn't a big factor in the offense. I don't think they'll worry about Jeff Wilson Jr. or any of these dudes that have been kind of in the mix in the past, right? And Achane, what does he have that Etienne doesn't have? Can this guy have a game where he has 10 carries for 90 yards and 5 catches for 40 and 2 touchdowns? Absolutely. He can carry you some weeks. I don't think Etienne's going to do that unless you get fortunate and he gets into the end zone twice, right? I don't think he's going to do that with his yardage necessarily. I don't think he's that type of back or nearly as explosive. So Achane I like. Henry I like too. I think Henry's even more explosive than him, right? And reeling off these big runs and games and scoring. Like he has a better chance to put together like a 200-yard game with 2 scores than Travis Etienne does. So I want some ceiling there. If I'm going to hit a home run with my RB1, that's where I want to go. And I think I can get it from other backs.
I think I'm still leaning Etienne over Achane, but it is close. And Etienne's plenty explosive enough. Give him some credit. But hopefully he can get a little bit more involved as a pass catcher. Moving on to Evan Engram. He moves to tight end 7 costs. People aren't as high on him after his huge finish last year at tight end 2 overall and half PPR. Tight end 6 in points per game and half PPR. A little bit higher in full PPR. Tight end 4 in points per game. I will say I was shocked. So Engram had 4 weeks as a top 3 tight end over the last 6 weeks of the season. Didn't even get close to that any of the other weeks. But weeks 13, 14, 16, and 18, he finished as a top 3 tight end on the week. Is it just a coincidence that Christian Kirk got hurt very early in week 13? I don't think so. His splits with Christian Kirk on the field and off the field are massive. From weeks 13 through 18 without Kirk, he averaged 15 points per game in half PPR, 73 receiving yards per game, 10 targets per game. And then weeks 1 through 12, he only averaged 7.5 fantasy points per game. 47 receiving yards a game. I mean, it was basically split in half for him, and it's because both play in the slot. I mean, those are the slot guys, and if Christian Kirk is there, he's going to be the main slot guy. And if Christian Kirk's healthy all year, I think we're going to be very disappointed in Evan Engram this year, even at tight end 7 cost.
Yeah, you look at the names around him. I mean, I know this is like the Trevor Lawrence of tight end for me, but Kyle Pitts, I think, can have a nice
Hey,
season
I'm
there.
with you for once. I would go Kyle
Yeah,
Pitts over
yeah.
Engram.
And George Kittle again. I mean, talk about like a guy that excites you a little bit more. I know I've been watching receivers, so I'm always excited about George Kittle, and we've seen with the 49ers. He's just a more fun player to have. And we saw him actually do some massive things with Brock Purdy last year down the stretch. So George Kittle is more exciting. Jake Ferguson in the role behind CeeDee Lamb seems to be more valuable. I think David Njoku and Evan Engram, these are the two guys I think I want to avoid most. Two guys that had scoring bursts out of necessity based on their situation last year that will not be duplicated. So I don't want to pay for the cost of Evan Engram at tight end 7 when he was tight end 6 average last year, right? I don't think I'm going to get any value there, where I think some of these guys have upside to outscore their draft position and ranking.
In full PPR, I'm a little bit more interested in him, but the touchdowns aren't going to come. You just got to depend on very high volume. And with Doug Peterson, he does love his tight end, so it's not out of the question, but I just think Christian Kirk is going to hurt him, and the splits with him on and off the field are just insane. So probably staying away from Evan Engram this year. We're going to get into the other receivers with the Jaguars. Christian Kirk, Brian Thomas Jr., and Gabe Davis are the 3 starting wide receivers for the Jaguars next year. One of them or 2 of them are going to be very fantasy relevant. So let's dig into it to close out the show. This episode of Locked On Fantasy Football is brought to you by the Game Time app. Buying tickets to your favorite events shouldn't be stressful. Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the music, sports, comedy, and theater near you. With killer deals on last-minute tickets and their best price guarantee, you can stop stressing over the tickets and start getting hyped for the fun you'll have. It's the fastest growing ticketing app in the country for a reason. Get images of your seat before you buy so you know exactly what to expect when you arrive. Buy tickets in a matter of seconds, 2 taps, and you're set. And tickets are sent directly to your phone, so you never have to dig through your email. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Again, that's code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDON NFL for $20 off. Terms do apply. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Have to turn down the volume with all that shouting. Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Let's hop into these Jaguars wide receivers to close out the Jaguars fantasy outlook for the next season. Christian Kirk is currently the highest drafted Jaguars wide receiver at wide receiver 30. So he's going relatively late for being a top wide receiver on his team. Then you have Brian Thomas Jr. at wide receiver 48 and Gabe Davis at wide receiver 61. Out of these 3 guys, who do you feel most confident will be Trevor Lawrence's top target next year? Is it just Christian Kirk? Because we saw that happen in 2022 when Calvin Ridley wasn't there, when he wasn't, when he was healthy all year. He was a wide receiver 18 in fantasy points per game in 2022. And he also shockingly led the team in targets and receiving yards from weeks 1 through 13 before he got hurt for the rest of the year last year, even with Ridley there. So I think Christian Kirk's a really solid value right now. He's not exciting, but he's a solid value as an older vet.
I sometimes don't get these rankings. Sometimes it's just like a dart throw. I'm not sure exactly who the top wide receiver pecking order is going to be. So, but if Christian Kirk is 30, then why are these other guys so low too, right? I mean, you can't have everybody low. This says this passing game is going to totally stink. Like, you need to have Christian Kirk separate, right? If you're so down on Davis and Thomas, then why wouldn't you be really high on Kirk? And maybe like we're leveling off on Engram, but yeah, Kirk is the only guy I'm interested in. And at wide receiver 30, he's the only guy that really has a good shot of going way above what he was, right? I think he can finish in the top 25, which is great. I'm sure maybe Gabe Davis, we know very hard to trust him as a big play threat. And Brian Thomas, he's a rookie. Again, that's reasonable, right? To take him as a wide receiver 4. We don't know his role. I don't think he's going to give you much more than that. Where I think Christian Kirk could be way better than wide receiver 30. And again, I think this discounts how important he is to the offense. I mean, I'm going to go back and make a weird parallel. Carson Wentz loved Nelson Aguilar because he worked in the slot when the best years of the Doug Peterson offense. Christian Kirk is kind of that role. The middle of the field is kind of Trevor Lawrence's best friend. Christian Kirk is his guy here. And that's the reason why he struggled a lot last year. He was not on this field. Kirk can separate, do some things in the middle, and really get open, and also make some big plays and score, which I also like about Christian Kirk at times. Like, he's not going to do that often, but clearly it's him and no one else here for me.
So I mean, I really like Christian Kirk at his value. I mean, there's some other guys around him though that I like as well. Like, this is actually the range of guys. I'm like, you can find some really nice value with Tank Dell going right there. I love Tank Dell, with Terry McLaurin going a couple spots after Christian Kirk, with Jaden Reed going right there as well. I like all those guys. I think Christian Kirk's probably the safest guy of this group to finish as a top 24 wide receiver. Being a wide receiver 2 on your team would be really nice. But yeah, I think he's in a nice area right there. But Brian Thomas Jr., I don't think he needs that many targets to be successful this year. He's a big play guy. He's just under 6'3", 209 pounds, ran a 4.33, absolutely insane. So great length and speed. Had 17 receiving touchdowns last year, averaged 17 yards per reception, but 12 of those receiving touchdowns were deep receiving touchdowns, 20 plus air yards that led the FBI. There have been 4 players that have scored 17 or more receiving touchdowns in a season in the SEC since 2000. That's Brian Thomas Jr., Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, and Devonta Smith. Like, he doesn't need a lot of targets to be a big play guy. If you get him around 100, 115 targets, I think he's going to have a really solid rookie season in terms of fantasy. And he's going at 105 overall around Cortland Sutton and Jamison Williams and Curtis Samuel. Yeah. I'm taking Brian Thomas Jr. there every single time if he lands to me.
Yeah, I love the receivers around Kirk. I love that range totally. And I think with Brian Thomas, I think he has some upside to watch. So we'll be looking for that. And I'm going to watch this battle closely in training camp between Thomas and Davis.
And I think neither of us have any desire for Gabe Davis. If he couldn't do it with Josh Allen in scoring as many times as he did, he was a wide receiver 50 in points per game last year, 39th overall. If you can't do it, Josh Allen, I don't expect you to do it on a different team with even more target. He's competing with other guys who are going to get targets. Definitely out on Gabe Davis. I know I loved him last year, not this year. That is it for today's episode of Locked On Fantasy Football. Thank you to you all for making Locked On your first listen every day. Everydayers will be back finishing up the AFC South shortly here, so don't miss it. Talk to you later. Have a great day. Bye, y'all.